Ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros, thank you for joining us for another episode of All the Angles, the Business of Padel podcast worldwide, powered by the Hexagon Cup. This week, our objective is to give you, our audience, a unique insight into the launch of the Padel Player Associations in Padel and explore the future possibilities for them. We're fortunate to have two individuals very well versed in this area. First of all, the person currently running, from the executive point of view, the Padel Association for the men's side, Carlos Alonso Gonzalez. He's spent a decade as a CIO. He's spent more than a decade after that as a CEO, and he's a board member of numerous companies before now leading up the PPA alongside Alex Ruiz. Joining him is Jonas Baer-Hoffmann. He has spent almost 20 years in player representation, 11 of those at FIFPro, of which 4 of those he was general secretary leading effectively the organization. He's now the special advisor to MLB Baseball Player Association and is also the SVP Global Business Affairs and the head of OneTeam International. We'll get into what that means further down the conversation. Before we get started, if you enjoy this episode or have benefited from previous ones, please like, share, subscribe. It really does help. So, without further ado, let's go back in time a little bit, Carlos. So, the PPA and the IPPA, which is the men's and the women's player associations respectively, they've been launched fairly recently. What were the circumstances or the tipping points that really led the players to feeling that this development was really necessary in the first place?
Well, first of all, nice to be with you both. Thank you for this opportunity to explain where we are. According with your first question, the real thing is almost 3 years ago, there was not any association about padel really in place because that was created in the context of creation of the Premier Padel. In the process of the change between World Padel Tour and Premier Padel. Obviously, before that, the groups have been working together in a small organization, being or reviewing things together, maybe supporting decisions, but not really as association. Association was created on the chain of World Padel Tour to Premier Padel. That's the real truth. And in fact, it's a specific solution or a specific way to solve the contract between the tour and the players. That was the real moment of the creation of the association for both, for men's and women's.
And so it was felt, I think, at the time that correct me if I'm wrong, that as the Premier Padel was trying to establish a kind of a credibility and a multi-stakeholder offering, it felt that it was important that it aligned itself with both the International Federation, FIP, and also obviously the two Players Association to really show that everyone was behind this new project. Is that fair to say?
Right. That was in more or less in the same moment. And it was the beginning of Premier Padel and International Padel Federation. That's right.
And before we get to your start, in those last 2 or 3 years, how did the PPA develop as Premier Padel found its feet?
In fact, that was the way the association was living in the beginning. Everything was around Premier Padel, International Padel Federation. That was the scope, the scenario where the association was working, just in making focus on that, making focus in the relationship with Premier Padel and with the International Padel Federation. That was the beginning of the association. And that's what the focus and the only scope for work.
I think it's fair to say, Carlos, you've come on board in an executive role in the last 3 or 4 months, since pretty much the summer. And it's not been quiet since then. There was the change of leadership, which came not just with yourself leading the executive, but also Alex Ruiz coming in as the president. And I guess my question to you is, what created those changes? What was the reasoning behind those changes? And I think that kind of brings us to where we've seen recently the increased press interest and press activity around the PPA. First of all, there was obviously the announcement about representing all players, professional players, so Premier Padel as well as A1 Padel players, as well as I'm sure any other players. And of course, during the Dubai tournament, we saw the announcements related to the heat concerns that making life uncomfortable for some of the players And the PPA again came out with a statement in order to support the players. And there was a bit of back and forth. The PPA made a statement, Premier Padel made a counter statement, the PPA made a counter statement to the counter statement. So, in a situation where the PPA, before Alex Ruiz and your involvement, was fairly quiet, the last few months have been a lot more vocal. Can you talk us through why that change happened and what does this mean for the PPA and for Pro Padel?
As we have been discussing before, in the first 2 years and a half before, the only focus in the PPA was to manage the relationship with Premier Padel specifically, and regarding with Premier Padel with International Padel Federation. And that was the moment when the new board leaded for Alex Ruiz, and you are right, that was in last June. And after that, the current management team came in with me and other ones, who is Jose Luis Lopez in the sport management. That was the moment when the PPA decided to change the strategy about which objectives we could have on place from this day. And in fact, that's supposed to have in place a totally new roadmap, totally new scope, totally new objectives about the association. And mainly that's supposed, I think, two important things. One of these is to represent all the professional players around the world, independently where they are playing. That is not an issue. And the other important thing is to have the players in the right position regarding the professional paddle market. We need to be on the position to be a part of the main decisions about the market of professional paddle, and to be the main part of the decisions about the professional paddle development globally. That is the main objective that we already have today, according with the new board, and obviously supported with all the players at the end are selecting the new board. That is a chain of trust at the end, okay? And that is the challenge where we are working today, about how we could join all the professional paddle players around the world, and how we could achieve to be these players taking decisions in the main factors about the professional paddle market. That is the new strategy.
And just before we add Jonas into the conversation, was this kind of decision to really move into a different phase of objectives and priority and activity, was that something that the players were calling for and asking for and eager to initiate? Or was this something where players were being more passive and were being said, listen, you are aware that you could be doing this, or you are aware that you should be involved in that? And they were like, oh, wow, okay, fair enough. Who's really sparking the ideas?
Yeah, I think mainly that is something natural. That is the natural position of the players in every sports around the world. I think if you consider which one is the main factor in any sports around the world, must be the players. We believe that is something natural, not something simple. Other thing is maybe when the players are not organized, are not with the right structures or with the right teams leading the players, that maybe not happen. But it's not because that is not natural, it's because they are not organized. That is the key factor. And today we are organized. We already have the structures. We already have the people supporting all the objectives that we already have in place. I think that is the only change. And my opinion, that is the history of all the sports, in all the history. It is the moment when the players are organized and in a right way to be together and following the targets together. And that is the moment for the paddle.
Jonas, I think there was a time not too long ago where there were sports and player groups where players weren't really that familiar exactly with what they could do, what they could strive for, how they could do this, what was the process. Now, when we live in a world which is so connected, social media savvy, all the players can see what other players are doing. The tennis players can see what the ice hockey players are doing. The paddle players can see what the basketball players are doing. It's so much easier to join the dots. But when you started working 20 years ago, I'm assuming it was a little bit more of an educational process, or is it actually still pretty much a lot of education going on?
Yeah, I think Carlos used the key word here. It's all about organizing. It's a continuous journey of conversation with the players as a collective. And a lot of that is education. A lot of that is building a collective understanding of what influence a group of people that is quite central to what happens on the court ultimately can actually achieve, and to build unity around it, right? Like those are the fundamentals of organizing any group of athletes, and quite frankly, any group of people behind a common cause, whether that's workers in a trade union, where that is people who want to, I don't know, affect change in politics. That's what it comes down to. But you're right, like those journeys have started in different sports for various reasons and at different times, right? The US player associations really started becoming powerful in the late 60s and 70s of the last century. At about the same time, some of the football players associations in Europe became influential. And you then see a journey where actually in sports or in competitions, which have maybe a shorter history, athletes are leapfrogging some of those developments, right? It's almost like they're cutting out the landline, right? They don't go from sending letters to using phones to the internet. They just jump ahead and go straight to cellular, essentially. That's what you see in women's sports a lot, right? They're really, really advancing past what sometimes the men have been able to do in a similar time. And I think you see it in sports like paddle, which are, I guess, not the traditional team sport context, because a lot of player associations are strong in team sport context, right? It's a little bit easier to organize. By nature, the team aspect gives you a bit of a collective sense. Individual athletes are oftentimes, well, they're in competition, right? Like their careers stand and fall with the success that they have against each other. So organizing them has always been more difficult. But a sport like paddle, which has such a really, like the hockey stick is pretty sharply going up, right? There is so much potential that really came out of, for those who haven't followed it closely, and I wouldn't say that I have been for very long, but it really happened fast. And I think that sometimes, as you correctly point out, in a day and age where they see what other athletes are able to affect, in a way where they see what commercially other athletes are able to generate out of their careers. If you then all of a sudden see, hey, wait a second, we're going from playing in front of 200 people to playing in front of 10,000 people, I think it just raises the urgency maybe a little bit faster than it was the case. And that's a great opportunity to just become powerful, become influential, help the sport grow sustainably, maybe faster than other sports have.
And you mentioned the word unity. As you said, in the team context, you've got that collective mindset already instilled from the very DNA of the game. And so it becomes a lot easier to say, listen, of course we have to look after the guy 10 rungs, 5 rungs, 3 rungs down the pyramid. In an individual sport like tennis or golf, it might be a bit more trickier. My sense, and Carlos, obviously feel free to interrupt me if you're wrong, I think paddle is somewhere in the middle because, first of all, it isn't a single game, right? It's a doubles game by definition. So you do have not the full collective of a 5-man squad, 11-man squad, 20-man squad, but you're a little bit further away from that singular mentality that you talked about, Jonas. And also, actually, I think the other advantage is the fact that so many of the players are from actually very few markets. So you don't have players who are competing in the top 100, top 200, who are from 80 different countries. They're probably, the vast majority of them, probably from 2 or 3 countries. And they all train together. It's a much smaller community, even if the sport is growing at an incredible rate. And so, Carlos, I guess you have a slightly, it's not easy, but a slightly easier ability to bring people together. So I guess my question that I'm leading to is, how have you found that unification process? Have you found it to be more challenging than you expected or easier than you expected because of the elements that make up the pro paddle scene?
I'm making maybe a summary that you are both saying. I think paddle is new, and that could be a handicap, a concern, and at the same time could be an advantage, depending for what. Okay. I think for to explain all the players where we are now without the right position to take decisions, for example, in general terms around the market of professional paddle, I think it's easy to show that and to have all the people supporting the change, because at the end it's something simple and very easy to identify. And this first step is something easy and is going well. I think everything is thinking on the same page that we need to have with our right position on the decisions. Okay, now obviously other thing no easier like this could be how we need to make the transition, because obviously we don't want to have another crisis on place for sure. I think the crisis is not good for nothing, but at the same time, we need to have the change. And that's the reason, because we are trying to talk with everybody, with all the stakeholders, everybody around the market of paddle, saying that, okay, we need to make the change. We need to be on the decisions. The players must be on the decision. The players must be the main part of the decisions. But, okay, we agree to have a plan, changing things and making the transition. Why not? And that is the point that where we are today. Obviously, the first step is not easy to have all the stakeholders understanding or supporting the change. That is something normal. But for sure, we are going to keep on looking for the change at the end, because it's our obligation, our objective, our responsibility. We are on that. And obviously, this process is not going to be easy, but we consider it's going to be possible for sure.
I think, Carlos, what you're talking about is there's sometimes this feeling that when the athletes are starting to organize and to demand a voice and to maybe bring their ideas forward, which may actually legitimately make the sport and the product better, they're getting blamed for the disruption, right? And that's a threat to how things should be run and how things should develop. But the resistance of the institutions, and I don't say that that's necessarily the case in paddle, you guys know that better than I do, but obviously I've seen this happen in many countries and many different sports. It's the resistance from the institutions that caused the crisis, right? Because if you don't listen to somebody who has a legitimate claim and you keep denying them a voice and you keep denying them participation, well, ultimately you force them to do something a little bit more radical to be heard. However, if you have modern, progressive, inclusive governance, which actually says, well, you know what, the players are a pretty essential part to all of this succeeding and all of this growing sustainably. Let's bring them in. Let's make them a partner in this. Let's frankly have the athletes co-own their sport and their industry. Well, you're not forced to do anything radical. You're going to remain united. You can be a massive asset because you can steer a conversation amongst the playing group, which also educates them about why maybe certain decisions are taken the way that they are and what the long-term objectives are and all of these things. And in almost all the sports where the athletes are genuinely and equally participating in how their leagues are developing, those leagues do better, right? Those leagues are more resilient against disruption by other competitors. Those leagues usually commercially fare better because the athletes are more bought in to promote the product. They're the best ambassadors for any sponsor, for any licensor, for every product that is coming out. And so it's oftentimes, I think, what you find in sport, because it is traditionally a quite conservative ecosystem, there's more of a fear of maybe the loss of control rather than embracing the opportunity that comes with it. And again, if you look at some of the sports leagues in the United States, they had to fight those battles. This doesn't come from today to tomorrow that they're in the position that they're in. They're the strongest player association in the world. But I think we can all look at them and say that they're economically quite healthy. They're the biggest leagues that have ever existed in sports. And part of that is because the athletes are fairly participating in what is being generated and that they're co-governing their sport and that therefore they're commercially contributing at the highest level that's possible. So I think those are lessons learned, which are sometimes maybe not appreciated enough. But athletes tend to, in the end, be reasonable. Not every single one of them, but once they get together as a group and they actually discuss things, they tend to be reasonable and they tend to know their sport better than anybody else. So there's a huge benefit of bringing them into decision making rather than trying to keep them out.
And one of the accusations that often gets put against associations is that players are selfish. Players tend to be less educated than people who have, done MBAs and various degrees and who are running these institutions. They are distracted because they're focusing on performance on court. And therefore, actually, it does a disservice to the sport to have them involved. Let me give this opportunity to really spell out, and obviously, Jonas, you've already talked a little bit about it in the previous answer. What is the value that player integration, player investment, player voice can add rather than just being kept out of the room?
There's a million ways of looking at that. Everything that you mentioned, I mean, you can always find an argument about why somebody should not be part of a conversation. Like history of humankind has given absurd answers of why certain people should not be part of how the world is being run. I would say athletes understand their sport better than anybody else. They tend to care more about their sport than anybody else. And once they're educated, what I think oftentimes happens and what the most successful player associations are really good at, athletes start understanding legacy and that their decisions and their impact is not just for themselves, but for the next generation that comes after. And once you're in the second generation of that thinking, you're reminded of what those before you have done and the responsibility that you now have to pass it on to the next ones. And that oftentimes means that decision making is maybe more forward looking than executives who need to succeed in this given season or who have a certain investment period that they need to return certain dollars for. So I don't think that any of those arguments ultimately hold true. But to your question more precisely, I mean, it really depends on which angle you're looking at it. I think commercially, institutions have a harder time than ever to create genuine long-term connection. And I think a sport like paddle, which I think by its very nature will become more and more global, institutions are very foreign to people, right? But people can become attached to people because they understand who they are. So the growth of sport, the marketing of sport works through individuals. So athletes being bought into this obviously makes this more successful. From a governance perspective, well, one, there is legal protection, right? If you can do things by agreement, you have certain protection that they're legally defendable, that they'll hold up in the case of challenge. And any well-governed democratic system obviously wants to make sure that the key contributors to that system, whether that's citizens or in this case athletes or in other case workers, are bought into the grand strategy. And in this case, grand strategy might mean how do we structure competitions over the next 5 to 10 years? And why do maybe athletes have to also accept certain elements that on first sight are not exactly what they want to do, but they understand where this is going? Now, if you just tell them that and you sort of expect them to blindly follow, you're going to face resistance. That's human nature. However, if you bring them in, you add what they think is best for the development of the sport, you find a compromise, you move from there. People are going to be more committed. So those plans will ultimately be more effective. A lot of this is not so different from management or effective governance in a political context. It's just applied in this very specific context, but multitude of layers from legal to commercial to really just governance of the sport, management of the sport, where on all of those verticals, you've got examples after examples after examples of where sports succeed, where sports fail, based on how this is being appreciated. Look into the press now, right? You've got the most advanced global sport in football. People are suing each other left, right, and center. Agents are suing FIFA, players and leagues are suing over the calendar, others are suing over the transfer system, etc. All of that is an expression of a lack of inclusive governance. And what does it mean? It puts the system at massive risk of disruption that is not always healthy and that creates friction. And obviously, sometimes people will have negative consequences of that. That is what you're preventing if you've got people at the table who share in the responsibility to run the sport effectively.
Let's move on to collaboration. So my question to you, Carlos, is at the moment, the PPA and the IPPA are separate entities with separate player boards and separate executive teams. How much do the two entities collaborate and align?
Yes, I think that is a common factor in the sports, to have an association for men's and women's. And I suppose that is because at the end of the day, if you are thinking on a professional sport, and that is the key factor, because if we have been only talking about sports, could be sense to have sense to be together. But as far as a professional sport, and that means it's a business at the end. I guess that is the reason, because usually in professional sport are always separate because are different business at the end, I think. According with that, that's the reason because in the beginning, both was created separate, and obviously we are working together. We are working connected for sure. Why not sharing targets? But at the end of the day, we need to be separate because today we are working together around Premier Padel. That is the real thing today. But probably in the new future, we are going to work together or separate depending the cases. That is the regular terms of the markets. And that is happening, I don't know, in all sports. Sometimes are working and playing together, and other ones separate. I think taking into account the average of the sports. I think that is the healthy way to have working together or sometimes working separate, but always connected, I think, and sharing some objectives.
And Carlos, to build on that question, how much does the PPA work with other player associations in other sports? Are those relationships and information sharing agreements, are those in place? Are they being developed? What's the stance of the PPA on speaking to and learning from other associations?
Thinking on the connection or to be together doing things, unfortunately, until today, not so much. That is the real truth. But if we are talking about if we are using reference, for example, obviously we are using reference of ATP or PGA or a sport that maybe could be a reference for us. By the way, we want not to be a new ATP, but for sure we can use some pieces of ATP when applied and to use this reference. That is the work that we are doing. But as Jonas was doing before, I think at the end of the day, it seems like there are so many connections or so many common scenarios in different sports about the players, about the calendars, about the, I don't know, business model, about many things that obviously, independently the sports, you could apply common solutions for all the sports. I think it's a pain because we could work more together between different sports, looking for good solutions for each sport, but sharing or applying same solutions. That is my feeling.
And Jonas, in your experience, like how important are those conversations, relationships, information sharing relationships, collaborations, alignments between different player associations in different sports? Where does that really come alive?
Yeah, given what I've done the last 20 years, it's probably a rhetorical question. I first got involved with this when a very small player association for basketball players was set up in Germany, really as I always call it like a garage startup. No real resourcing, just bootstrapping along the way. And from there, we pretty quickly got involved with establishing a European umbrella organization of player associations. And essentially everybody but football, because football through FIFPro had already an existing structure. Next step was building a global umbrella organization called the World Players Association, where today virtually all the player associations are coming together and where younger organizations like in paddle, but also the oldest organization like some of the football or North American PAs who are around for 60, 70, 80 years are coming together and sharing best practices and adding leverage to what each other needs to find. And look, I think the crux of it always is that it's a bit of a lonely job, right? Because if you're running a player association, you are obviously a particular stakeholder in an ecosystem that's not always, it can't always be aligned with the quote unquote establishment, right? You have to sometimes be the opposition. You have to bargain with the employers or competition organizers. And that sometimes can get a bit frosty. Having a network of people around the world who, one, understand exactly what you're doing, but also two, when you get together, the reality is usually somebody in a room has faced what you're currently struggling with or trying to overcome at some point on their journey of their player association. So it obviously just helps to not have to reinvent the wheel all the time, but being able to rely on each other and figuring out how other people approach certain things. And in my opinion, it's the surface on which you can build new opportunities. And that's obviously what we're trying to do in the commercial space right now with OneTeam International, but also in other areas, right? Like player development programs, the education piece of what comes after your sporting careers. A lot of those programs, people are learning from each other, they're exchanging, they're building the right infrastructures with each other to set those up. So yeah, I'm a big believer in it. I also just ultimately, as we said, these organizations, they build on the solidarity and the unity of the athletes. And then the same should obviously apply to these organizations amongst each other, right? To work together and to be united and to help each other to be strong. And that's the basis on which we've created these bodies. And I think they've added tremendous value to all the player associations across the different sports.
And Carlos, let's talk about the future. Can you spell out the targets or the objectives for the coming years for the PPA? And I guess where I want to end up is, and this maybe sounds like a weird question, but From the PPA's point of view, what does the perfect pro paddle ecosystem look like?
I like to start with to answer these questions with the main objective that we already have, going to the end of the process. Okay. In the end of the process, we expect to have in the professional paddle ecosystem a situation where the professional players could choose in the free way where we are going to play each week. Okay. We want to have a global proposal around the world about tournaments and circuits, and each player is going to decide where we are going to play each week, thinking on sport factors, personal factors, economical factors, but thinking on that, taking the free decisions. That is the final objective that we already have. Okay. Obviously, to have this in place, we need to, as we have been discussing and talking before, we need to make a important transition. We need to define a new ecosystem, and we would like to have all the stakeholders or all the actors adapting the position to create this. And obviously, that cannot happen in one click. No? I think we need to procure that, introducing change, I don't know, in the next 3-4 years, but making a plan to produce this scenario that we are fixing as a main objective. Okay. Today, I think we are on the first step. We are looking to have all the professional paddle around the world joining us. That is the first step. And after that, we want to be an important part of the people who is going to decide about the calendars, about the formats, about the new tournaments. It's very important for the sport, for the professional paddle, to have all the potential investors being inside the system, inside the ecosystem. Because today, obviously, there are many investors around Premier Padel, for example, but there are other ones going out, making other things as an island. You know, I think it's like different people working in different areas, different geographies, different formats, without any connection. I think that is not the way to produce more and better professional paddle around the world.
So you envision a world in which there needs to be a coordinating entity that looks at formats, calendars, timings, locations, creates a strategic flow and system to what is being offered to the players as well as to the fans. And it's important to you, obviously, fundamentally, that the players' associations are a pivotal piece of that entity and the decision making of that entity. Is that a fair summary?
Right, totally right. Maybe one important factor is we consider PPA as a professional padel association globally must be, you know, the neutral part who is going to decide the better things for the padel.
Mm-hmm. And sitting where you sit today, Carlos, what do you think the PPA need? What more do you need in terms from the players, from investors, from partners, from the other stakeholders? Because obviously this podcast goes out to a lot of people who are in the business of paddle. And some of them might be thinking, what can I do to support the PPA and their objectives? What are the obvious things that you are looking for to help you in your mission?
First of all, we are sure that the first step is to explain the ecosystem that we want to create, because at the end of the day, we want to be the people committed as far as soon they are going to be agreeing with the model, obviously. And we need to inform all the stakeholders, all the actors around the professional paddle, around the paddle at the end, about which idea we already have as a players to build this ecosystem. And according with that, we need to have plans in place with federations, with brands of sports equipment, I don't know, with other sponsors, with investor, promoters, everyone's working on the same direction. Obviously, we need to be all of them working with us for the same model. That is very important. In fact, that is something probably new. We want to be all of them involved, all of them inside the model, with any Islam so far making other things. The options gonna be to be all of them together working for the same objective.
There's an interesting component in here, right? Because that's where a lot of the sports systems just differ so much, right? If you compare the US system to the European system, in the European system, oftentimes you have a regulator that sits across a multitude of competitions, but is also themselves a competition organizer, right? That's where calendar clashes oftentimes come from, because there's clashing interests, which are not actually the players' interests in terms of different competitions. It's between different competition organizers. But then these entities are regulators of that same market. In the North American system, these leagues are sort of cut off from the rest of the ecosystem, right? Both in terms of youth and international, right? The NBA does not really, I think, care too much about how FIFA regulates the rest of global basketball. They've sort of insulated themselves from that, and because they're so big, they can. They're regulators of their own competitions, but the only way that they can do that is through collective bargaining, because labor laws basically otherwise would clash what they're doing, and also antitrust laws, competition laws would clash with what they're doing unless they had bargaining as a means to basically justify that those are democratically accepted conditions for both players and clubs/employers. I think this is an interesting architectural question about what's the right model for paddle. Where I would agree a lot with what Carlos said is that in a sport so young that, quite frankly, in order to be sustainably successful, needs to tackle more markets, needs to drive towards additional audiences, needs to speak to different demographics, age groups, etc. Innovation is really important. People need to try different things, right? The current model, the tennis model, or another model may not be the right model that ultimately serves this sport the best. And probably locking yourself in too early into one operational structure that's too dominant. Well, if that model works for that structure, they have very little incentive to try something else, because that maybe works according to their business plans and to their investors' interests, etc. But they themselves would probably benefit if somebody else tried something different and was almost a guinea pig for how a different structure, a different format may function. And if a sport is not culturally as established as a football is, or a basketball in many parts of Europe, etc., and so the competitions themselves don't necessarily have that strong connection to their audiences, trying those different things early, I think, is really important. Plus, events like paddle are not just competing with traditional sporting events, they're competing with these streamer sporting events, whether it's Kings League or Icon League, and all of these competitions, which are, I guess, speaking to similar young audiences about how sports can be consumed in the future. So all I'm saying, I guess, is that in those early years, to provide the platform where you have a common regulatory system in which the athletes can rely on certain minimum conditions that they should meet wherever they go, but at the same time allow people on the competition organizer side, which, by the way, might be athletes as well, right? Like, athlete might come together and say, you know what, we've got an interesting construct about how to pull up competitions, right? Since we're driving the sport anyways. But providing space for that innovation, I think, is really critical for it to flourish and find the best model where it's unique in the marketplace, where it speaks to different audiences, maybe in a different way than the more traditional, more established sports do.
Let's spend a minute about the media. So Carlos is in the middle of this kind of growing, I wouldn't call it a media storm, maybe that's overstating it, but Carlos and the PPA are sticking their neck out around various issues. And it may surprise you, Jonas, that not everyone is welcoming their position with open arms.
Shocking.
You've been through these trials and tribulations for a long time. How do associations and the players they represent weather those storms, weather that criticism? Because it's difficult. You need a bit of a thick skin, right? Sometimes you're positioned as the rich kids who don't really know what they're talking about. You're spoiled. That's the way the media will portray players, because players aren't necessarily considered as the downtrodden, underprivileged individuals.
Yeah, look, a part of this comes with the profession. If you choose to do this work, don't expect to be popular. Aim for being respected. I think that's pretty much where you want to be, but you're not always going to be popular. You have to say things that are maybe uncomfortable. Let's not kid ourselves, especially the economic interest of the athletes and the competition organizers are not always aligned. The big picture one, yeah, we want growth. Of course, everybody wants growth, but then how is the cake being made and how is it being divided up? All of those questions. There are competing interests. There's no way around that. That said, what I think is important is, one, whatever you say, it needs to be backed up by the players, right? Because that's ultimately who has the power. When I'm in these positions, Carlos in these positions, quite frankly, I mean, we're both sitting here in polo shirts or rugby shirts, but we're just suits, right? In sort of a colloquial speak. Like, it's the players who have all the relevance and all the power. So they need to really stand behind whatever is being communicated. Two, consistency, right? If you start playing political games to favor one side over another side, etc., that's going to get sniffed out very quickly and it's going to be detrimental. So keep consistent positions that are strongly embedded in what's the player's interest. And then I think you need to obviously just reach a very strong position that can be backed up in facts and research, and if push comes to shove, data or the law, if that's helpful, whatever you're arguing, so that you can't be called out for it, right? Because it's always very easy to discredit a position based on maybe a lack of information or trying to establish an argument that's not maybe so sound. And that's a lot of the work that we did at FIFPro, right? Like developing what we called basically our IQ platform, which was really a data-driven platform to start establishing things in fact, doing research projects, pulling arguments together, which ultimately weather the storm of opinion because they're based on facts. That's not something so common in sport, actually. Opinions are a lot more common than fact. And I think those are really important pieces because you are, of course, a little bit of a challenging voice, right? That sometimes gets people a little bit annoyed. But as long as you can always go back, one, this is what the players want. Two, we've been consistent about it. Three, we're basing this on facts and research and not just opinion. Eventually it'll start cutting through. Now, it might take a minute, but I think eventually it'll start cutting through. And then, the players need to be united. That's where we started the conversation. That's what it in the end all comes down to.
I wanted to, Jonas, talk to you about the OneTeam partners model. So this is a more modern structure where you have the player association as we traditionally understand it, that unites the players more for protection and standards and things like that. That's the tried and tested decades old model. Now you've seen these associations spin off commercial vehicles in order to really explore aggregated IP opportunities for the benefit of the collective of the players, whether that's OneTeam partners or whether it's Winning Alliance, or there are various commercial vehicles now sitting under these associations. You're obviously very well versed in that development, sitting in OneTeam partners at the moment. Can you talk a little bit about what's the benefit of that structure? And do you think Padel is in a place to be starting to look at that, or is it too early?
So let me give the audience like a couple of paragraphs of context. So player associations in the United States, because this is where most of this is emanating from, going back to the 70s, they started to aggregate what we call group player NIL rights, right? So name, image, likeness, image rights, as they're more referred to in Europe. They can be individual and they can be collective, right? So collective usage is Panini sticker albums, computer games, etc. And so players going back 50 years have started to put them together under their union, where the union basically has the mandate to represent them whenever, let's say, a company like a Panini or a Topps or somebody else wants to use, for example, 4 or more players in the same product. Definitions always change a little bit. And so athletes have started to control those rights through their player associations, both for licensing purposes and for sponsorship purposes. And fast forward basically about 5 years ago, the NFL Players Association and the Major League Baseball Players Association created the company called OneTeam Partners to basically charge the commercial capabilities that the unions have at their disposal. Today in North America, representing NFLPA, MLBPA, NWSL, so the Women's Football League, MLS, Men's Football League, US Women's National Team in football, the WNBA Players Association, etc. And my job now building similar ecosystems for player associations, groups of athletes, really around the world, no matter what sport they potentially play. Now, a few obvious advantages of it: you create additional revenue, because oftentimes, especially internationally, the licensing business is not done very well and player image rights are not represented very well. So this drives additional revenue to players, but also as the players get more active in this space, oftentimes the other side benefits as well, because you put out a set of trading cards or stickers, usually the brand will want to have the players in their jersey or with the logo of the competition. So they're buying that IP as well. Second of all, it's just really good for marketing a sport, right? Because once you represent that IP, you're selling that with everything that you have, and you're trying to position the athletes vis-a-vis brands, vis-a-vis fans in the most optimal way. And you're really zeroing in on the athlete's storytelling and their positioning. And so what it has done for unions on the other side is the players are oftentimes then dedicating some of those resources that are being earned to fund those unions, which means those unions are financially independent. They have capabilities to really meet the other side of the table, where they're at, right? With people who have the right professional qualifications and the means to negotiate and to represent and provide services at the right level. And you get a stake in how your sport is being built, because you're part of the economic value creation, not just the on the field or on the pitch or on the court value creation. Going to your last question there, look, I don't think you can ever be too early for that because the earlier you can create an appreciation for how these rights are being structured and how athletes and competition organizers or teams can cooperate around creating value, because this is a very cooperative process, right? Like more than 90% of the revenue is being created when both of those entities and that IP works together. And I think the fact that the USPA started establishing this also for their sport at a very early moment in the commercial growth journey made it a lot easier than it is maybe today to step something like that up in a league or a competition structure that's 50, 60 years old. So I would only encourage paddle players to start thinking about how not just maybe their labor rights or players' rights, but their economic rights can best be protected and obviously then monetized to help themselves. Obviously this drives revenue, but also to help the sport grow, right? Like we've spun off of the core business here in licensing, we've spun off content businesses, we've spun off venture plans and programs that we're running. And all of those things ultimately just add value to these sports so that they grow faster and the fans have better chances of engaging with the athletes.
Carlos, I want to give the last word to you. We're going to have to wrap up in a minute. Do you feel like Padel is ready for this? Because at the moment, it feels like you're focusing on protecting player welfare, event standards, calendar integrity, etc. Do you feel like PPA is ready to start thinking about what's the commercial and economic rights that we can start exploring on behalf of our Padel player members?
For sure, yes, I think. Because I think that is something simple to copy of other sport at the end. Because at the end, we are talking about platforms, we are talking about digital channels, we are talking about innovation. Why not? We could apply all of this to the paddle sport. We don't need to invent nothing. We need to do the same like other sports are doing, just to apply these systems, this business model, these channels like paddle. I think that must be not an issue. The issue is to have all of the actors doing the right thing, all the business. But the rest is just to copy and to play the same business model.
Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you very much for that. That about wraps up our episode. Again, please like, share, and subscribe if the content was thought-provoking. Please comment on LinkedIn or Twitter if you have any recommendations around our format, topics we should devote an episode to, questions we should ask, speakers we need to bring on. We want you all, those driving the next phase of this industry's future, to tell us what you want to hear about and who from. Thank you, Jonas and Carlos, for joining us today. We will keep doing our best to cover all the angles of the business around paddle, episode after episode. Till the next one.